You guys here for the giant anteater talk?
Yeah.
Yeah, so my name's Joseph and this is Diego. He's our giant anteater here at Wild Discovery. There are a few different types of species of anteaters. The giant ones are actually the largest out of all of them. And Diego here as well, we have been told he's actually quite big for a giant anteater, so they shouldn't get much bigger than this. But it's quite an impressive size. Now, as the name probably suggests, these guys like to eat insects. Not always specifically ants, especially these guys. They usually live in places like South America, and they'll find termite mounds there instead, and they'll eat termite mounds. So they'll eat from termite mounds, but they will sometimes eat things like ants as well. So they'll eat about 36,000 insects a day, or that's what they need to eat. We can't supply that for him here at the zoo, unfortunately, so instead what we give him is what we like to call his gruel, which is just in this little plate over here that he's finished up because he just loves it so much despite how it looks. And basically what his gruel consists of is just ground up insects, a few vitamin supplements, and also some peat, which is like, you know, fancy mud, and that all gets mixed up in water and put in this bowl for him, and he absolutely loves this stuff. It doesn't look particularly appetising, but he really likes it, and it gives him everything he needs to survive. But out in the wild normally, with termite mounds, they're quite well adapted to eat from these. So number one, they're quite concealed, but you can kind of see how he's like walking on claws, almost like walking on knuckles. And he does have two very large claws. And he basically uses these to puncture holes into the termite mound. You can actually see where he's done it here with some of the rotting logs in here, where he just started pulling away at them and like tearing them apart. And that's what he'd do out in the wild, is he'd basically get his claws, dig them into a termite mound, pull open a hole, and then they'd be able to start eating. Now, he's got a really great adaptation, which I think a lot of people know about for these guys, which is that tongue, and that tongue is absolutely exceptional. So, he can actually fully extend it out by about 2 feet, and that's not just 2 feet from the base of his mouth, it'll fully come out full 2 feet. Unfortunately, the only time you'll ever really get to see that in action is in the mornings, and that's when we come in, we'll see Diego and we'll say, yeah, good morning, Diego, and he'll look at us and he'll have a big yawn. And when
Talk. So I'll introduce you to our animals. So we've got 6 otters in total. We've got mum and dad, so their names are Jeff and Ollie, and then 4 of their offspring, and their names are Joy, Troy, Roy and Leroy. And they're not babies anymore, they're all like full, but they all live together. And then we've got our family of Binter on here. So this here is our female, her name's Bimmer, and Bimmer is 3. And then this is our male, his name's Dougal, Dougal's 5. And then the little one at the back, that's our baby, he's about 15 weeks old, and his name is Raffles. And he's called Raffles because the man who gave Binter on their scientific name was called Thomas Raffles, so we thought it was quite fitting. So the type of otters that we've got here, these are Asian short-clawed otters, and they're the smallest of all the otter species. They also spend the least amount of time in water, so they have less webbing between their fingers and much more dexterous hands. They also have really sharp teeth because the bulk of their diet comes from shellfish. And they're also considered to be quite intelligent as well, because it's not uncommon to see them using rocks as tools. So they'll use the rock to bash open the shell and get the meat out from inside. And that's not for you, is it?
They're not unintelligent.
No, exactly. So these guys live throughout South and Southeast Asia, and they live on the coastal shorelines, just sort of dipping in and out of the water as and when they need to. The reason they share a habitat with these guys is because these guys are also from Southeast Asia, so they're from places like Malaysia and the Philippines. But they're what's known as an arboreal species, which is just a fancy word for saying they live in trees. And they're really well adapted for this, because they're doing quite a nice job at demonstrating for us. So they've got these really sharp claws that they use for gripping onto branches. They can also rotate their hands all the way around, which means they can walk down trees head first. And they also have what's called a prehensile tail, so they can use their tail like an extra limb and suspend themselves from it. So really, really well adapted to living up in the trees. Because they live up in the trees, about 80% of their diet is fruit, which makes sense, that's what's growing up there. But the other 20% is actually meat. So they'll eat things like eggs, they'll eat birds, they'll eat small mammals. They're actually not brilliant hunters though, they're sort of more opportunistic in the way that they get their food. If I'm honest, they tend to steal it from nests. They are quite unusual. When we look at them, they don't really look like anything else. In addition to that, the word has no direct translation into English, so we don't know what the word means, which looks really interesting.
You can't go on the swing, baby, there.
No. I think they'd be a bit fed up.
Should I go on my shoulders?
You want to go on your shoulders? There we go. That's better than the swing. So, they live in different family groups, as you can see. So otters tend to live in big family groups, the mum and dad, and then generations of offspring. And the reason for that is they work together to keep themselves safe. So if a crocodile attacked them, the entire group would run at the problem, and they would like scratch its eyes, scratch its ears, basically to annoy it, and then the crocodile think, oh, it's too much like hard work, I'll go find something easier to eat. That's a process called mobbing, and it's really effective. So average group size tends to be around 30 out in the wild. Binter are slightly different. They typically live by themselves. However, when there's an abundance of food, they have been found living in little groups as well. So it just depends on what's available to them. Hi, mate. Oh, so so yeah, they're really well. These guys tend to live.
So what we're going to do is we're going to start off by meeting Tockle and Bell. So Tockle and Bell are two of my blue and gold macaws. I say two of my blue and gold macaws, there are only blue and gold macaws. But these guys, they come to us all the way from South America. Now in South America, where these birds are from, these guys are very often just high up in the trees. You don't see them coming down to the ground all too often, albeit they do rely on eating clay out in the wild. And the reason behind this is that a lot of their food out in the wild is actually quite toxic. So when they go around feeding on the fruit, nuts, seeds and berries, the toxins contained in them are actually neutralised and soaked up and absorbed by the clay, and it passes through the birds. Lots of animals in South America actually do this. Now when these birds are out in the treetops and they want you to know where they are, they will sometimes shout. And when these guys shout, it can be up to 106 decibels. So they're quite a loud bird. Considering the bellbird's the loudest of all the birds at 120, these guys aren't far behind. But what we're going to do is we're going to do a little bit of flying with Mindy. Now with Mindy, unfortunately, she's not the most agile of flying birds. She's actually quite clumsy. So sometimes when it's windy, she tends to miss where she's going. But Mindy, being a barn owl, is one of the actually most widespread birds of prey on the planet. These guys live on 6 out of the 7 continents. You find them everywhere from Australia all the way. Unfortunately, climate change has meant that these birds are now struggling to get out hunting. And why they're struggling to get out hunting is because we're getting lots of wet and windy days all back to back. Now these birds have got hardly any protection on their feathers from the rain, So when it rains, these birds can't fly. On top of that, these are actually one of the slowest of our flying birds, flying at around about 15 to 20 miles an hour when they're hunting. So when these birds are flying at that speed, if your wind speed's higher, it stops them from actually being able to hunt in that way. Now, climate change is completely natural, just the pace that is happening isn't. So we've had a drastic shift in the climate here in the temperate parts of the world, and that drastic shift has been faster than often thought of as being able to predict the death of someone within your family. And how they do this is they'll go and land on the roof and they'll start calling, and that tells you that someone in your household is about to die. So with that being the case, lots of people, especially in the Indian mountains, they tend to try and chase these birds away. Now, just like Ghost, Maya here hunts very stealthily. She's very quiet when she flies, and when she flies, what she'll do is she'll fly over the tops of her prey as they're walking along paths. So these birds, they use eyesight when they're hunted, but they don't actually come out at night. These guys come out at dawn and dusk, so the posh name for that is crepuscular. So when these birds are out hunting for their food, these guys will predominantly try and eat animals that are quite small. They'll eat animals they can swallow whole. Now, the trouble is, sometimes animals that you can swallow whole run out in an environment. So then these guys will actually switch to eating bigger prey. And the biggest prey animal known to be taken by one of these birds was actually an adult peacock, which is a bird about 3 times the size of her. But with that being said, she does have the skills and the tools to do it. So when these birds are hunting, what they'll do is they'll sit on a little station like this. It might be a rock, it might be a tree, it might just be a big mound next to a path. And once their prey walks past, these birds will drop down, they'll jump on top of them, and then they'll plunge their talons into their back. Now, when these birds plunge their talons into the back of their prey, these birds are going to be gripping at a pressure of around about 600 pounds per square inch. So these guys have got, try not to grab my hand there, Maya. So these guys have essentially got some of the strongest feet in the bird world. Now, unfortunately, when you're a bird like this, these guys are quite transient, not a lot's known about them, as these birds will move around from one territory to the next. And as these birds are moving from one territory
adventurous snails escaped and began to colonize the islands, eating away at the crops. To combat this alien species, the rosy wolf snail was introduced to the islands to hopefully eat the giant African land snails. Unfortunately, the Partula snails are much smaller and slower, so an easy snack for the rosy wolf snails. This has caused every species on the island to become vulnerable to extinction. Thankfully, the rosy wolf snail has now been eradicated, and we are looking forward to sending our tiny little monkeys, the Goldie's marmosets, who are neighbours to the emperor tamarins, you will see later in the outdoor enclosure. Both species live in the Amazon basin, living on a diet of mainly insects and fruit.